Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to use Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari's theory of minor languages from their work A Thousand Plateaus in order to gain some insights into how to read James Joyce, particularly his hardest two and latest two novels, Ulysses and Finnegans Wake. Now, I've done some lectures on Deleuze and Guattari's theory of minor languages before. I've incorporated it into certain lectures and done stuff on its own. So if you want to see more detail on that, check out those. But I'm going to give us a few excerpts here, which, especially if you've been reading Joyce, going back and looking at these passages for me, I've seen all the profound insights that Deleuze clearly saw in Joyce. And by using this theory of minor languages, a sort of creative aspect to speaking in one's own tongue that accepts the immanent difference within every utterance, I think we can actually gain a much richer understanding not only of Joyce, but of all authors. And one of the important aspects of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of linguistics is it is best described as a linguistic theory of immanent pragmatics. So, if we look at, for example, an ideal approach to language, we would see it as a series of rules and regulations whose goal is to be followed. This would be linguistic prescriptivism, that linguistics, using language, is a series of prescriptive acts which need to be followed. Whereas you have the more pragmatic approach to language, which would be linguistic descriptivism, that language's goal is to describe various speech acts, various internal states, by making them external and trying to convey some nuances through the differences inherent to each utterance. And that is what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to do. They write, "I swear is not the same when said in the family, at school, in a love affair, in a secret society, or in court. It is not the same thing, and neither is it the same statement. It is not the same bodily situation, and neither is it the same incorporeal transformation. The transformation applies to bodies, but is itself incorporeal, internal to enunciation. There are variables of expression that establish a relation between language and the outside, but precisely because they are immanent to language." And this is one of the things that I love about Deleuze and Guattari, is you might think that this statement, "I swear" here, is one statement, and no matter where it is uttered, because it has the same meaning, it's the same thing. Well, Deleuze and Guattari are trying to point out that it is not the same thing. Saying "I swear" in, for example, a sexual encounter with a lover versus saying "I swear" to a judge in court are entirely different situations. And as they point out, it is not the same bodily situation, and it's not the same incorporeal transformation. This is that transformation of the internal state of the meaning that's trying to be conveyed into a system of, signifiers and whatnot, of a language that can be transmitted. So here, there is an aspect of enunciation of what a word means, which is internal and immanent to the language. And Deleuze and Guattari are going to try to stress that that immanence to language means that that language is going to be extremely sensitive to situations, a lot more than we like to think. We like to think that "I swear" is the same in these different situations, but Deleuze and Guattari actually want to show that it is not. Now, the assemblage is one of Deleuze and Guattari's famous concepts that they use. Assemblage theory is basically the child of Deleuze and Guattari, the very schizophrenic child of Deleuze and Guattari. And For all intents and purposes here, an assemblage is basically just a constituent of elements which have an internal logic to the assemblage and then relate to other assemblages via logics between those other assemblages. So it's kind of a collective whole of sorts. And an assemblage can be an assemblage of enunciation. This would be the kind of milieu in which you construct your language. So this would be influenced by all the ways that you've been taught language, all the normative ways that you're told this is how you're supposed to speak English, to all of the things that you see in media that kind of take language other places. And there's lots of different assemblages of different kinds. But Deleuze and Guattari write, the collective assemblage is always like the murmur from which I take my proper name, the constellation of voices, concordant or not, from which I draw my voice. I always depend on a molecular assemblage of enunciation that is not given in my conscious mind any more than it depends solely on my apparent social determinations, which combine many heterogeneous regimes of signs, speaking in tongues. To write is perhaps to bring this assemblage of the unconscious to the light of day, to select the whispering voices, to gather the tribes and secret idioms from which I extract something I call myself, moi. So we can see here that the usage of language is part of what gives us our sense of selfhood, right? Just like Judith Butler is going to show that gender is one of the primary ways which we attain selfhood, which we attain some sort of permanence in our identity. Language, too, is a way that we extract different elements that are, in discordant nature with one another. We extract them and we put them into a sensible series of some kind. We extract from this collective assemblage of enunciation, this molecular assemblage of enunciation. And from there we build language. And this doesn't depend just on social determinations, as he said, because it depends on a logic of signs, of meanings and determinations, for whose job it is for each person to not only speak in tongues, which is to say speak their own sort of language with its own logic, but to try to externalize that through language. If you're confused about their theory, maybe this will help. This is what we are getting at, a generalized chromaticism. Placing elements of any nature in continuous variation is an operation that will perhaps give rise to new distinctions, but takes none as final and has none in advance. This is perhaps one of the most important passages for grafting the theory of minor languages onto the work of Joyce. Because if you read, for example, Finnegans Wake, it's often very difficult to even get off the ground because it's so experimental. It's so on the cusp of things that it's so interpretable. And as such, it's very tempting to get bogged down, and this is not to place a negative value judgment on this, but to get bogged down in the academic discourse of trying to solidify some final meaning. Many Joyce scholars don't do this, but some do. And it's important to be able to look at Finnegans Wake in really any piece of great literature as something which is going to, as they say, give rise to new distinctions and take none as final, and also has none in advance. That the interpretations in the work are somehow both immanent to the work and simultaneously dependent upon the circumstances which give rise to or allow for that immanence to rise up. So it's a very interesting theory because it's not like the essence of literature is already within it, as if there is some final meaning we are trying to reach which is bred into it and, can't go anywhere. Deleuze and Guattari don't like that talk of essences because it seems like we're speaking about those essences from some sort of omnipotent perspective. as if we have all the knowledge of what every reader is going to bring to the text, and that's not really what Joyce wants to do. And if you read Joyce, you'll find that he rewards the amount of knowledge you have. And you can also reward Joyce and the future of the text with your own insightful interpretations based on your own background. If you go to like a Finnegans Wake book club, you'll see people from all sorts of perspectives coming to add little, oh, there's a bunch of math jokes here, or oh, there's all this stuff about Irish history, or oh, there's all this stuff about linguistics. There's all of this stuff which is both bred into the text, which Joyce has carefully put into motion through this generalized chromaticism, but also hasn't forestalled the possibility of new interpretations because none is final and none is there in advance. This passage bears a lot on how I read any author. It was Proust who said that masterpieces are written in a kind of foreign language. That is the same as stammering, making language stammer rather than stammering in speech. To be a foreigner but in one's own tongue, not only when speaking a language other than one's own. To be bilingual, multilingual, but in one and the same language, without even a dialect or patois. To be a bastard, a half-breed, but through a purification of race. That is when style becomes a language. That is when language becomes intensive, a pure continuum of values and intensities. That is when all of language becomes secret yet has nothing to hide, as opposed to when one carves out a secret subsystem within language. One attains this result only by sobriety, creative subtraction. Continuous variation has only ascetic lines, a touch of herb and pure water. A rather pretty passage, and also very insightful for looking at both Ulysses, but especially also Finnegans Wake. Because not only does Joyce literally breathe in other languages into Finnegans Wake, but he is making English itself stammer. He's speaking in his own tongue, but in a way that brings out the breaks and holes within English and the other determinations, the other linkages that we don't really think about. So it's not necessarily that he's speaking another dialect of English. No. He is speaking in his own style. And that's the mark of a true artist, who is able to bring out in English its own unique style with its own stamp. And as such, Finnegans Wake has become a sort of open secret, as Deleuze and Guattari talk about here. You use a sober gesture, creative subtraction, to subtract from the collective assemblage that is language as a whole, that is English as a whole, whatever it may be, and you subtract from that values and intensities from which you build your own unique linguistic project. Now we finally get to the moment of minor languages. Using the aspects of language we've built on so far, Deleuze and Guattari make a contrast between major languages, which are prescriptive. They are the kinds you're taught in school. It's Queen's English, so to speak, right? It's the normative application of English as some sort of universal that can cross all boundaries, that can cross all differences and apply to all sorts of different people without changing at all. It is a sort of static rock, much like when Leopold Bloom in Ulysses goes into the museum and he's been reflecting on Molly Bloom, his wife's kind of sublime real beauty, and then goes to reflect on the beauty of stone statues in a museum. So it's sort of that real versus ideal understanding of intricacy, of difference. And major languages are quite literally a stone, so to speak. They are immovable, and because of that, they're uncreative, they're unalive, they're rather boring. But a minor language uses that sober gesture we talked about. and it puts values into circulation in a system crafted by an artist in order to take advantage of the holes of the rough edges of deterritorialization, as Deleuze and Guattari say, in order to craft something unique. As they write, minor languages are characterized not by overload and poverty in relation to a standard or major language, but by a sobriety and variation that are like a minor treatment of the standard language, a becoming minor of the major language. The problem is not the distinction between major and minor language. It is one of a becoming. It is a question not of re-territorializing oneself on a dialect or a patois, but of deterritorializing the major language. Black Americans do not oppose black to English. They transform the American English that is their own language into Black English. And we're going to stop there for a second because there's so much to talk about here. I've done a lecture where I talked about African American vernacular English, which is the more official name for this Black English that Deleuze and Guattari speak of here. And dialects such as these, or languages such as these, are often considered inferior. They're considered more barbaric, lacking in complexity, lacking in effectiveness of communication compared to the major or standard language. But in fact, Deleuze and Guattari want to try to show that it's not a question of poverty so much as it is a unique becoming of the major language, which is to say it is a process which is applied to a language which pre-exists insofar as it has had to be taught, as it is a normative framework which one is birthed into and has to succumb to. It operates on that major language in order to create a language as process, which is a becoming minor of that language. And therefore, the minor language is never something you reach insofar as a major language can be solidified and has a sort of constancy. It is imposed and it is a normative framework. But a minor language is perfectly individual. The language of Finnegans Wake is perfectly Joyce's own. That's why I feel strongly that Finnegans Wake is untranslatable. Not because you can't go word for word and try to translate it over, but because you lose the flair, you lose the style, you lose the particular connections that Joyce is trying to make when you try to translate it or change it in any manner. And as such, these minor languages, which is the becoming minor of a major language, is always setting in motion the normative process or the normative aspects of languages which already exist in a way that requires you to steadily come back to the text and glean something new from it, which is exactly the kind of thing that Joyce wants us to do when we're reading his text. We always come back, we have new life experiences, we've read new things, we get more illusions, more insights, and that is a profoundly creative and exciting process. Minor languages do not exist in themselves. They exist only in relation to a major language and are also investments of that language for the purpose of making it minor. One must find the minor language, the dialect or rather idiolect, on the basis of which one can make one's own major language minor. That is the strength of authors termed minor, who are in fact the greatest, the only greats. Having to conquer one's own language, in other words, to attain that sobriety in the use of a major language in order to place it in a state of continuous variation, the opposite of regionalism. It is in one's own language that one is bilingual or multilingual. Conquer the major language in order to delineate in it as yet unknown minor languages. Use the minor language to send the major language racing. Minor authors are foreigners in their own tongue. If they are bastards, if they experience themselves as bastards, it is due not to a mixing or intermingling of languages, but rather to a subtraction and variation of their own language, achieved by stretching tensors through it. So, right, we have a sort of creative journey that Deleuze and Guattari want us to embark on. It's bastardizing our own language, purposely making it obscene to those who would consider it normative, those who would try to look at the language and impose some rules upon it. And they would see that, well, this is a completely unknown language all of its own. And it sends the major language racing in a way that is just exciting and is quintessential of Joyce to me. So how do we use this to understand Joyce better? Well, if we look at Ulysses, Ulysses is Joyce's big kind of experimental moment in his career. In his oeuvre, this is the moment where he really comes alive as a unique artist, not because the other works aren't unique, but because this takes experimentation as equally as important as it does the words on the page. The form and the style is just as important as whatever descriptors or nouns Joyce chooses to use. And in Ulysses, I'd like to look at a passage in which we can see this blending of form and content in a way that crafts a unique minor language by paying homage to the major language and to the customs and practices which go alongside that language itself and which have sort of formed out that language in order to make something perfectly unique. So in this passage, which we can find in chapter 13 of Ulysses, this is the Cyclops episode, Leopold Bloom is in a pub with a very nationalistic, very ideological man whose name is the Citizen. He never gets a name other than that, but he sort of stands for the Cyclops in the Homeric parallel. He is one-eyed insofar as he has a one-eyed approach. You know, if you put one hand over your eye, you lose depth perception. You lose the ability to be as clear-headed. And this Citizen is going on this rant about all the things that the British have done to the Irish, all the different massacres that have taken place, and then it expands more broadly to talk about British crimes as a whole in Africa, in all of these different places. And Joyce chooses at this moment to interpolate the language into the form of something that I think you might recognize. They believe in Rod, the Scourger Almighty, creator of hell upon earth, and in Jackie Tar, the son of a gun, who was conceived of unholy boast, born of a fighting navy, suffered under rump and dozen, was scarified, flayed, and curried, yelled like bloody hell. The third day he arose again from the bed, steered into haven, sitteth on his beam end till further orders, whence he shall come to drudge for a living and be paid. Now, if you have grown up in the West, you will understand this for what it is. It is an interpolation of the form and general style of the Apostles' Creed. And if you've grown up in the West, you'll notice that even if you're not particularly Christian, maybe you grew up Christian and you're not anymore, maybe you never grew up Christian, but we live in a cultural milieu shaped by Christianity. And as such, some people know things about Christianity just because they've grown up in it. So we can see here that the Apostles' Creed has been emptied of its content, and the skeleton has remained. The general form of I believe in God the Father Almighty has become they believe in Rod the Scourger Almighty, such that we have the crimes of the British grafted on to a typical symbol of British piety, right? Of we are the carriers of the gospel to the rest of the world, and that is our justification for our empire's expansion. So the idea of God has become the idea of Rod, right? The idea of spare the rod, spoil the child. of corporal punishment, of British people, I should say, the British government as the Scourger Almighty, the creator of hell upon earth. And we recount the British crimes against its various colonial subjects in the form of something that is sort of latent within the major language that is English. So when we are taught English, for example, we may even learn certain grammatical or syntactical customs which are the result of the influence of things like the King James Bible or the Geneva translation of the Bible, right? We have all this little stuff inside us, which Joyce has put into creative circulation here in a way that tells us something about the hypocrisy of the British in a unique literary style. Now, when we come to Finnegans Wake, it is a whole new level. Finnegans Wake took Joyce 17 years to write, and he didn't write anything else after it that we know of. And Finnegans Wake is the epitome of a minor language. I found this rather funny photo on the internet. This is about the first half of the first page of Finnegans Wake with spell check on. And you can see that basically the entire page is spelled quote unquote incorrectly. But that notion of incorrectness only applies if we're coming from the perspective of a major language, which is to say, if we're coming from the perspective of language as a normative framework that is to be obeyed. But, as we all know, rules are there to be broken, and artists are there to break those rules via their particular artistic means. And for Joyce, that is to take language to its very limits. And in so doing, yes, he's sort of riffing on language, so to speak, right? If you're a musician and you riff on a melody, you kind of keep that same form, similar to how we did with the Apostles' Creed in the previous example, but we add some new stuff such that it harkens back to connections we might not have made. And that is what Finnegans Wake is all about. It's all about reaching across all the sorts of avenues that are latent within the English language and bringing them all into a creative moment. Here's another very similar passage from the opening of Chapter 5, Part 1 of Finnegans Wake. And it's very similar for a number of reasons. I'll read it first, and you tell me what you think about it. In the name of Anna, the All-Merciful, the Ever-Living, the bringer of plurabilities, hallowed be her eve, her sing-time sung, her rill be run, unhemmed as it is uneven. If you didn't recognize it, this is riffing on the Lord's Prayer, right? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it goes on and on and on. But you can see here that Joyce has just taken the first half of the Lord's Prayer. And he's put a lot of stuff into it, a lot more connections than we had in Ulysses. Everything is pretty surface level on that episode in Ulysses. If you look at that example, it's pretty clear to see what's going on, especially if you have the context. I know it might be more difficult because I just kind of plopped it here for you to see. But we've got some interesting stuff to see. First, in the name of Anna, the All-Merciful, the Ever-Living, is very similar to in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, the opening of Al-Fatiha, of the Quran. And in this way, Anna is sort of hearkening back to Allah, which is very interesting because Anna also means mother in Turkish. So we're hearkening back to some mother. But what mother exactly? Well, Anna Livia Pluribel, one of the main characters of Finnegans Wake. She's sort of the archetypal mother, and in Finnegans Wake, right, the consensus is that we are in a dream. We are in probably one person, maybe multiple people's dream. It's sort of, maybe it interpenetrates at times. It's all very unclear. But one of the characters, Anna Livia Pluribel, or ALP, is sort of this archetypal mother. And we can see with the bringer of plurabilities, that's a hearkening back to Pluribel, as in ALP, Anna Livia Pluribel. And Anna Livia Pluribel's name herself, Anna, is a palindrome. It's spelled the same forward and backwards. And this has a lot to say about ALP in Finnegans Wake. It is a cyclical process or pattern that stretches all the way back from the beginning of history through the present and into the future, right? The ever living. And the all-merciful, mazi in Turkish, means olden times or old times, right? So it has this ancient connotation of Anna Livia Pluribel stretching all the way back to the ancient times, to the old times. And then instead of hallowed be thy name, it's hallowed be her eve. Haloed, as in the halo we can see on Jesus' head here, this is a typical Christian marker of piety, and significantly, it is a circle, hearkening back to that cyclical motion of Anna Livia Pluribel. And then her rill be run. A rill is a brook or a small stream. It is a small channel cut in rocks by running water. So this aspect of the rill is important for the creative potential that Joyce sees in this archetypal mother figure, that the mother is the sort of birthing of possibilities, of linguistic possibilities that we can see here in this example. And then also, unhemmed. Think about what happens when you hem a piece of clothing. You restrict it, you fold it inward. But to be unhemmed is to be unimpeded, is to be open, it is to be flowing freely, as does this archetypal Anna Livia Pluribel, because Livia is a hearkening to the river Liffey, which flows through Dublin, acts as sort of the life force for Dublin, and one of the historical reasons that Dublin became such a big city. And as such, this figure of femininity is mixed with water, which we can see from the beginning of Ulysses, but is very prominent in Finnegans Wake. And this sort of creative potential of the mother streaming through the rocks that are the ideal, through the immovable, and making them move by this creative force of both destruction and creation. It is an unhemmed force. And it's also uneven, right? Just as a river is uneven, it meanders all over the place. So too does Anna Livia Pluribel show her unevenness. Creativity is uneven. It's unique. It's perfectly individual, as I said with all minor languages. Thus, I hope it's clear to see the relationship between Deleuze and Guattari's theory of minor languages and Ulysses and Finnegans Wake. Deleuze and Guattari do actually explicitly mention not only Proust, but Joyce, for example, in A Thousand Plateaus. So there is, an explicit connection. I'm not necessarily just pulling this out of my butt, but nevertheless, you can see the applicability, hopefully. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodern philosophy, including Deleuze and Guattari, German idealism, gender theory, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. Maybe you need help with some reading or talking about some philosophy problem. I also have super thanks available if you want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap. It'd be appreciated. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you in another one.